Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. A very good evening and welcome to another edition of Health Matters. This time we highlight teenage suicide. I never thought this would be a discussion for us to talk about, and especially in our community, you think, you know what, we're not affected by it. But let me tell you, when I did some Google search and highlighted some of my interest with regards to teenage suicide, I got some big scares when it came to that, and bullying. So tonight we talk about teenage suicide and bullying, the real link. We also took to Joburg streets to find out what you had to say, some of our viewers, and if people really understand what's going on with teenage suicide. Please do have a look at this.
Yes, it is a concern because young people, when they kill themselves, it means that they introducing a different issue, like the things we never used to do, our old people never used to do back then. So it's like it's going to be a big concern.
I think life throws more challenges to younger people at a younger age.
Teen suicide is like lack of knowledge.
Okay.
Lack of knowledge is like this. Don't take every problem on your head.
Yeah, too much pressure on kids to perform. Media doesn't help the situation. Facebooks and all that, it doesn't help the situation.
It is, because a lot of people nowadays, particularly teenagers, are being influenced by a lot of outside sources, people they think are cool, things they think are cool, such as drugs. They want to get high until they don't feel no more, and it's quite unfortunate. I just wish that we had better role models to look up to.
Yeah, they should just talk to someone. Find friends to speak to. That's all I can say about it.
Just remember, you have your own qualities. You were created with specific qualities. And work on that and concentrate on that and be the best person you can be.
What you need to do is understand people, and at least if you've got brothers around, then they can help you out.
So there you have it. Joburg residents had their say, and also a little bit of their understanding of teen suicide. So now let's welcome our specialist in studio, Jasmine Kuvaji. Thank you so much, clinical psychologist representing SADC here today. Thank you so much for your time. She's also head of the unit of psychology at the Chris Hani Baragwana Hospital. Thank you so much for joining us. Very good evening. And as well, our resident medical specialist, Dr. Shahida Umar. Shukran so much, director for Teddy Bear Clinic. Definitely touches her in every way, this topic, teen suicide. So Dr. Umar, please give us a brief introduction to the show, inshallah.
Shukran dalilan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I think it would be unfair not to cite from the Quran that the Quran makes it clear that human life is sacred. And I think a lot of the Holy Scriptures speak to the sacredness of life. Life cannot be taken without justification, and the right to life is inherent in the tenets of Islam. Life itself is a gift from the Creator that we are obliged to care for. Suicide out of despair of God's mercy or worldly problems is strictly forbidden. Now we know that over 800,000 people die annually as a result of suicide. As we speak, every 3 seconds a suicide attempt is made. We also know that 75% of people have attempted suicide or have cried out for help before they've actually attempted suicide. So what does the Holy Scripture speak to? What does the Quran speak to? It speaks about compassion, sensitivity, kinship, reaching out to. So whilst it forbids this kind of conduct, it also speaks about a holistic approach to reaching out. It speaks and propagates to medical intervention, psychosocial support, and humanity reaching out for its human kind.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much, Dr. Umar. Quickly, Jasmine, if we could start with you. I know that you are representing SADC. You're not there full time, but please do tell us the role of SADC in this instance and what we need to understand about suicide.
So SADC is South African Depression and Anxiety Group. They're a non-profit organization that advocates and psychoeducates for mental health illness. In fact, it's one of the largest in Africa. And their basic aim is to educate and to prevent instances like this that may happen, especially now that we're seeing a rapid increase in suicide tendencies within our youth, especially between ages of 14 to 24. So in terms of suicide, what we need to be mindful of is, one, the rates of suicide are increasing dramatically. Our youth are actually being impacted significantly. So what we're trying to engage is actually making people aware of what the signs and symptoms are, what to look out for, so that if we can save one life, we're doing actually a good job.
So Dr. Umar, tell us, why should we as South Africans and individuals of this community highlight this concern in South Africa?
I think as Jasmine has indicated and alluded to the fact that this is becoming a prevalent problem. The incidence has certainly increased. It's on the increase. It's escalated. And we find that more and more children find themselves in a state of desperation. We've had children as young as 7 years old who have committed suicide. So it's not something to be taken lightly. And I think we need to also realize that we need to go beyond just awareness raising and conscientizing. We need to look at mobilizing, escalating the mobilization to action where people are in a position to reach out and get the necessary support and intervention that they rightfully need.
Okay, so let's understand our topic for today: teenage suicide and bullying. What is the real link?
So there's a significant link. And what we see the trend going is, as the years have been going, we're seeing the link increasing, where bullying is playing a much major role in terms of putting the young adolescent or young child at risk of actually harming themselves or committing suicide.
Okay, so is it first bullying? What, just educate us about the train that actually happens when it does come to teen suicide.
So, remember, we have to remember that bullying is just one factor in a whole big system. So risk factors will include already an existing mental health illness, or living in a harsh environment, or even parents suffering from mental illness. And what happens when bullying happens, bullying can happen at school, it can happen on social media, it can happen in various platforms. And when that child feels like they have no way out, or they have no support system, or the very people that should be supporting them is not supporting them, they want to take away that pain and that overwhelming feeling. And therefore, sometimes they lead to making a decision of suicide.
So Dr. Ma, do we understand, and how do we understand that people often say that you attempt suicide to prove something or to get attention? What is your reaction to that statement?
So I think one needs to understand what drives a person to the point where they need to take their own lives, to bring everything to an end. It takes a lot of desperation. I think Jasmine spoke about the loneliness, the isolation, the withdrawal, feeling absolutely alone, that there's no way out, feeling trapped. And that is the reality of the situation, where a child or an adolescent feels, I won't be able to live this through. And so it's actually that total state of hopelessness, helplessness, and feeling absolutely powerless, feeling that there's no way forward. And that drives a person to that.
So a lot of issues also arises when the older generation feels that, listen, this is happening in this time, but it didn't happen in our time. What is the problem? What are the causes? Why is this the case? It's not that real and of a concern. Your comments to that?
So I think there's a few factors in terms of that. It's not that it didn't happen years ago. It probably did happen, but we didn't have the media platforms to showcase and to educate and to inform people that this was happening. And now in this generation, when technology has boomed, what we're finding is that, remember also, the more people hear about incidents over social media, then also the more indication that this person also thinks that this could be a way out. But remember, talking about suicide doesn't make someone think about committing suicide. It's about, if someone feels yes, that plan worked for that person. I wonder if I could do the same thing. And the more the talk of suicide, it becomes more of a known factor. Therefore, adolescents start playing into those kinds of sectors as well.
So let's quickly understand, before we take a break, Dr. Umar, how do you explain suicide to a young child if they are involved in this incident? Not necessarily being suicidal, but it happens to their young brother, their sibling, or even at the school, and they don't quite understand. So how do you explain suicide?
Well, I think that's something very important, because how do you, even death, just talking about death, you know, induced by trauma or accident or whatever natural causes, it's difficult to speak to a child. So talking about suicide to another child is even more difficult. So I think it's obviously one needs to look at age appropriate and share with the child that the course or the journey of life, that we are born and we go through certain phases in our lives. We might be struck by illness, etc. And it's not in our hands when our life comes to an end. But when somebody feels ill, feels they, you know, they cannot understand what's happening to them, they cannot speak about what they're faced with, and then resort to bringing their life or taking their life away. I think one has to be age appropriate depending on the age one is targeting at, and you know, obviously, but it's a very challenging,
it's delicate.
you know, I think explanation to reach out to a child.
And it happens on the spur of the moment, because the child will just like hit you as a parent, you know, what is this about? And for me, the first thing would be, oh my goodness, what do I say? So just to take a breath and say, maybe I'll explain it to you later, because the words might not come all together at the same time. At that time.
Yeah, I mean, I've had children saying to me, a 4-year-old saying to me, I'm scared. What is death? What is dying? Because they've attended a funeral or witnessed a death in the family. So now, how do you explain to a child the suicide? Yes,
absolutely. We'll come back with that question as we educate our viewers in understanding teen suicide and bullying. There is a real link, but taking more of your questions, comments, and queries after this. Please do stay tuned. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome back. A very good evening. This is Health Matters, Teenage Suicide and Bullying. There is a real link, and we have specialists in studio with us, Jasmine Kovadi and Dr. Shaida Umar. Shukran so much, ladies, for joining us. So just before the show, your comment, just before the break rather, your comments on that conversation when it does come to suicide with little ones and talking to them.
What I find is very helpful to first understand what they're actually thinking. Because remember, children, before they even ask you the question, already have assumptions in their mind. So part of it is, if you ask them why they're thinking of such or how they understand it, it's easier for you to correct that misperception.
You go back with the question.
Exactly. Otherwise, if you're in shock that they ask you that question, you're going to faff around, you're not going to know what's actually, and they can pick up, you know, that you actually don't know, you're unsure. If that happens, then yes, it is a good idea to say, I'm going to come back to you. But I think to try and avoid that is ask questions about trying to understand how they're thinking, what their fears
so you're engaging.
Yeah.
And you're making it a conversation. Yeah, absolutely. So let's look at warning signs, because we want to get into the suicide issue. Warning signs associated to teen suicide and adolescent suicide as well, because we're getting a question with regards to university students as well.
So I think the major risk factors is depression and anxiety that puts a young person at risk of harming themselves or committing suicide. And I think if we can keep eyes out for those kinds of symptoms. So you're looking for changes in their mood. Remember, because we're not just looking at typical depression. Sometimes what you find is someone can either sleep too much or sleep too little. They can eat too much, eat too little. Someone will isolate themselves. Someone will start having mood changes. Small children don't want to go to school anymore. They'll complain about stomach aches, or they actually just don't want to go anymore. University students start locking themselves in their res rooms or or start not attending classes. So I think if you start picking up a change in that person's normal routine, I think that's an indication in itself to actually be aware or mindful that something may happen. In terms of specifically suicide, you're looking at things of someone may start saying goodbye to people, someone may start saying thank you for everything you've done, or someone's tying up loose ends in terms of financial things. Even a depressed person, the moment they have planned the suicide, you'll notice a sudden shift in their mood that's actually better. And the reason for that is because they, in their minds, know there's going to be an end solution. And that's when our concern also starts to happen.
So, Dr. Umar, how do we associate suicide and mental illnesses to the understanding of you practicing a certain religion and your beliefs, and sort of mental illness in a whole, and why we are not talking about it?
I think we know mental illness is still perceived as a social stigma. People still shy away, people still frown upon mental illness. And I think the important thing to understand, it's like any other illness. And one needs
the brain is an organ.
Indeed. Yeah. And one needs to reach out, and interventions and where necessary, medication, etc., needs to be administered. The person needs professional intervention by a medical practitioner, a clinical psychologist, a psychiatrist, depending on that. So I think that is something we need to firstly and foremostly appreciate.
So taking sort of your personal beliefs and issues around religion out of it completely.
Indeed. And I think we need to also realize that if we just look at the Quran, and I think even other holy scriptures, it makes provision for medical treatment. That is something that we often seem to forget or gloss over, that no, religion does not allow medical support, which is not the reality. And it makes provision. And so we need to succumb to that and accept that, embrace it, because the moment you embrace the mental illness, you are in a position to reach out. You're more empowered and able to reach out to address that illness.
Jasmine, your comments?
So I think, the stigma also increases because, remember, unlike other diseases, psychiatric diseases or mental illness is not necessarily tangible. So we can't do a blood test, we can't do an X-ray to then diagnose a psychiatric illness. And for example, if we think about depression, be it within a child or a young adult, people then give the advice of just snap out of it, just stop thinking negatively, just get over it. And in fact, that's the worst advice to give, because even though logically that person knows they shouldn't be thinking that, the mind has taken over. And unfortunately, the mind can be your best friend or your worst enemy. So if we don't help that person understand their thoughts or what they're going through, they actually just can't snap over. It's not a behavioral thing. It's not a choice. No one has chosen to have a mental illness. And I think that's the struggle that people can't understand.
Yeah. So let's look at some of our questions. One coming in through with regards to a university student. We'll get to that in a minute. In which race group is suicide prevalent and the highest?
I think it's in all race groups. I don't think it's favoring one race group over the other. Unfortunately, in South Africa, there's not necessarily the most accurate stats that we have on it, but it affects all classes, all race groups, and all age groups.
Okay. Dr. Shaida?
Yeah, I just want to add to what Jasmine said, is that it occurs across the spectrum. And in terms of the accuracy of the statistics, as we mentioned earlier, there's a social stigma attached to suicide. And of course, people bring religion in and it's frowned upon. So there's the denial of many cases of deaths where it hasn't been reported as a suicide. So that obviously affects the accuracy of the statistics and in the different population groups or racial groups. But it does affect everybody, rich, poor,
doesn't ask
all
for
colors
creed.
And all religious, all faiths.
Absolutely. So how common is bullying at university, especially the earlier years, and how does one deal with it?
So it's actually very common at the moment. And remember, there's different types of bullying. There's peer bullying. There's also bullying from the academic staff themselves, in terms of the lecturers, in terms of the seniors. So, you know, students do have a tough time. Remember, a lot of students are also struggling. It's a year of adjustment as well. It's someone that may never have left home, now living on residence. They have to adapt to that. So there's many factors that are, you know, affecting our young youths, you know, that's the 18, 19-year-olds, in terms of their mental health. In terms of how to deal with it, it's about, once again, not being scared to ask for help, is to intervene. And not just that person asking for help, but even as friends, as peer support. If you notice anyone that's struggling with something, it's to aid them or encourage them to also get that support that they may need.
Yeah, you know, you talked about, and what Jasmine touched on, I just thought it just triggered a lot of recent challenges that we've been faced with: the hazing, the ritualistic initiations, you know, and a lot of that, when she talked about adjustment, coming into a tertiary institution, and suddenly they have to face up to this manhood, a different phase and stage in their lives, and the way they get initiated into that is also, there's a lot of bullying there. And a lot of that bullying, you will find that impacts on their behaviors. Jasmine spoke about the depression, but we've also had cases, if we go back, Wits University and other universities, where we've had students committing suicide and exploring the causes or the contributing factors. Some of it had to do with bullying, where students felt the misfits, they felt they didn't belong and they were not part of the peer group.
I'm also just coming to think of something with my sister spoke to me about when she moved up here, and she said there was a case in, I think, Erasmus or Lodium, where a child actually jumped off a tree. I don't know if it was by accident, if they actually meant to commit suicide, and he fell into a fence with the bars, and he, of course, you know, went through him. And the kids, the children at the school all saw this. I mean, what sort of intervention should then need to be taken place, you know, if something like that does happen?
So I think definitely the children need to be debriefed, the children that witnessed it. You know, all of them need debriefing, the family, the kids that witnessed it, the school staff, because people need to understand how that happened. Because sometimes when you speak to children, you'd be surprised how they actually take on a lot of that guilt. Like if someone said, oh, you can't climb that tree, and he did, or if he fell. So you actually don't know what's happening in the minds of the young children. And that's why debriefing groups are so important, to actually relay any misperceptions or any undue guilt that the children may be feeling.
But Jasmine is talking about something that's so powerful, because the onlookers are so affected by it in different ways. And I think what you spoke about, guilt, the survivor guilt. Sometimes friends who have maybe ignored or did not take it seriously, suddenly feel that they let down their friend. They should have done this, you know, could have, should have, would have. And that's survivor guilt. So therefore, that outreach or reaching out to people should be absolutely to the larger community, even to the academic staff, because everybody's affected by it. And people often feel that they've let down or they failed where they should have actually been more circumspect and aware of the situation.
So another parent has also mentioned that at the time the daughter was at high school, and one of the fellow matriculants had actually committed suicide, and the entire matriculants were like had to get a break and all of that. And the parent didn't know how to deal with it or help her child. What would happen in that instance?
It's about creating the environment to be able to have that open and honest communication. Because remember, if your child feels too scared to talk to you, you're actually shutting down communication. So it's not to be scared to approach the topic. Because what parents do is they see their child struggling and then they avoid actually talking. And they think, okay, let me just give them some space. Let me just leave them alone. But actually, yeah, you can give some space, but actually an appropriate amount of space. You have to go to the child and say, not ask questions, because sometimes if you say, are you okay? They're going to say yes, even if they're not. So it's about asking open-ended questions in terms of, how do you feel about what happened? What did it mean for you? What's the worst thing about it? What's, you know, how are you thinking about it? So ask questions that actually open up communication, so your child can voice to you their fear, their anxieties. And remember, it's not about curing all those anxieties or
Yes.
sweeping it under the carpet and not wanting it to be there. Because part of the healing process is about accepting and acknowledging and being okay with those feelings actually existing.
Absolutely. So we talk more on teenage suicide and bullying, the real link, and also understanding what suicide is about, mental illnesses, and get that conversation going within your family members. Even if your children are still young, you want them sometimes to understand what it is about. So maybe just prompt that question to them as well. But we talk more and your comments, questions just after this. Welcome back. Please do interact with us, and shukran so much for those who have been. Thank you to you and your questions on suicide, teen suicide specifically, and bullying. I saw this very interesting video going around on Facebook of a little boy who, 9 years old, saying he wants to hit his head against a door or a wall and kill himself. I want to kill himself. He was crying and the tears was going, and his mother was actually a video that we wanted to play, but it was very hard sore. So if you're able to look for it, and we'll try and put the link up, because it is a little bit, of course, to sensitive viewers, it will affect them. But understand that this is a real thing. 9-year-olds, 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds, sometimes even as young, talk about bullying, talk about suicide, age appropriate. But we have our guest in studio. Thank you so much, Jasmine and Dr. Umar, for making time available to talk to us about this topic. So warning signs, what are some of the warning signs for teenage suicide? You've mentioned earlier on distance, change in sort of their routine, but anything specific that, when it comes to therapy, maybe that can help?
So in terms of, further warning signs, I think the parents should always keep an ear out in terms of if the child is verbalizing issues in school, take them seriously, open the conversation. Don't just always say, don't worry about it, it'll be fine. Okay. Because that's when we actually make the symptoms of feeling helpless and hopeless even worse, because that child doesn't feel heard. So it's about, if there's any issues at school, if there's any, especially in a peer group, if the child is struggling to associate with people or feels like they don't belong, or in any way actually feels that something's wrong with them, that they're not good enough, those are all the signs to also look out for, that your child may be struggling with some sort of depression or anxiety, or actually even a reactive depression because there's something happening that they're not okay with. In terms of therapy, there's different types of therapy that parents can seek, in terms of either play therapy for young children, in terms of cognitive behavioral therapy, also for young children right up to adulthood. There's psychodynamic therapy. So it also depends on the fit of the person and the therapist as well.
Okay. So, Dr. Umar, if I could ask you, moving on to bullying, how do we encourage victims of this very terrible issue in the schools and universities to actually talk about it?
I think, well, we spoke about awareness raising. I think it's critical that that is consistent across the spectrum, starting from very young, when children are already in ECD facilities. We need to speak to safe and unsafe touches, acceptable and unacceptable behaviors, demonstrating, getting them to demonstrate what does a safe touch represent. When you hug somebody, under what conditions and circumstances, when is it okay to embrace somebody, getting them to appreciate and understand the empathic responses of being punched, of being pinched, of their hair being pulled or pulling somebody else. So doing that to others and having it done to you so that they can appreciate what it feels like. So it's going deeper for them to understand how it feels. So if it feels uncomfortable, if it feels painful and a sense of dis-ease, it's likely to be the same for the other person. So when I speak to that, when I say consistently, as far as the curriculum speaks to that, we need to start young. Okay, we need to start working right through high school and even the tertiary institutions, because bullying is rife at university. As we speak, the higher educational institutions are faced with the scourge of violence. And what are we seeing? We are seeing the result of the gender-based violence issues. It starts off with bullying and it ends off quite destructive, where victims resort to suicide, are suffering from depression, and as a result, we find that people are faced with a lot of trauma.
Ripple effect. So let's quickly understand and I want to start there if we're able to now, and somebody can make a change in the ECD centers. Are these educators, these teachers, these helpers in those centers, creches, play schools, equipped to sort of teach children?
So I like
about
what the way you've identified them and labeled them, because they are helpers. They're not all certificated. They have limited skills, so therefore we refer to them as practitioners, because some of them may be certified. So there are programs now in place under the ambit of the Department of Education, where there are workshops being provided to ECD practitioners to empower them, enable them to identify the signs and symptoms of abuse, to look at if a child is at risk, if a child comes from an impoverished context, the risk factors there. So to understand children and to respond to it appropriately, and to know the channels of reporting as well. So already that's in place. I think it's work in progress.
Brilliant. So why do bullies think that they are funny when they're doing this?
So remember, when we think about bullies, part of them is, one, power over that individual. Two, remember, when someone's bullying the other individual, they've got a crowd around them, sometimes spurring them on. And the moment they have even 2 or 3 people acknowledging and laughing with them or colluding with that behavior, they assume they have power and they're doing something right. I want to bring up a very important point, though. So even though we know the victim has to be looked after, the growing trend is actually we need to pay attention to the perpetrator themselves, because children are not born naughty or bad. They're not born as bullies. Something is making them into a bully, which means that bully has their own issues, whether they're a child, whether they're an adolescent, whether they're a first-year university student. So we have to understand what's actually going on for that person to be a bully, because they are also at risk of committing suicide or having a mental illness as well. And that goes undiagnosed and under the carpet as well.
So
bullies are crying out for help.
Yes. So often in parent workshops, we hear a child feels bad, acts bad, because he feels bad. And that child is not bad. Often we are labeling the child, and that sort of then predicts a behavior for the child to actually act in that way. So your comments about that, Dr. White?
And I think you've just summed it up so beautifully, because we as I've always repeatedly said, even on the show, that behind that bad child or mad child, there's a very sad child. And that's what we need to look at. What are the triggers? What are the unmet emotional needs that is driving this child to that? And that is what needs to be addressed, to peel those layers, because usually there's a very sad child, a child that is really desperate, wants validation, is seeking approval, affection, but is not responding in an appropriate or adaptive fashion, is resorting to destructive means, maladaptive behaviors, because that is their way of resolution and taking charge of their lives.
Absolutely. So let's look at...
No, I was just going to add on to that. I think what parents need to understand, semantics is very important. So when the parent tells the child, you are being so naughty, they actually internalize that label. So it's about separating the child and the behavior. It's about saying, that behavior that you did was very naughty.
Not you were naughty.
Yes, because I think that's very important to separate it. Otherwise, the child starts behaving in that manner as well.
And taking that question back, do you think what you did was appropriate, was naughty? And you get that conversation going open.
Because children start living out that prescription, as Jasmine says. When you say you're bad, so I'm bad. They said I'm bad. So now it's almost, bad. I've got license now to shoot and do as I please because I'm bad. So they live out that label. And that is where we have to be very careful. And I always say, speak to children in the power of choices. It's not if you do that, you're going to go into the corner now. It's time out now to say, and I repeat, and I think I often say to parents, you need to repeatedly say to your child, if you choose to do that, you choose not to have that. So you are telling the child, you are in full control, and we're giving you back that sense of power. It's your choice that you will decide what you want, and ultimately your decision will depend on the outcome.
The consequences.
So it gives back the child, the
power to them. Yeah. So quickly, the symptoms or behavior that a child is showing that they are possibly bullying, and how you can help them.
Well, I was just, I was going to add on to that in terms of parents react to behavior. All educators, all of us react to behavior. And what we need to understand is try and understand what the message behind that behavior is. Because either that will give you insight into what the child is going through, or it will give you a message in terms of what that child needs. So it's to focus not on the acute behavior of that child. It's about asking yourself, what do I think that child is going through in that moment of time? And then try and resolve that instead.
So we look at solutions after this. Please do stay with us. Teen suicide and bullying, and understanding the real link. Your comments, questions, more after this. Don't go anywhere. Assalamu alaikum and welcome back. Our last few minutes as we discuss and keep the conversation going, not just for this month of March or February or the week or highlights this awareness. No, it's every occasion when we can, and it comes up, the youth, the youngsters, peer pressure, bullying, and it starts as young as the ECD centres, the creches, the play schools. Get that education coming out of your ears, like they say literally. So teen suicide and bullying, understanding the real link. We have our specialist in studio, Yasmin Kuverji, clinical psychologist at the Better Hospital, Academic Hospital, and our in-studio specialist, Dr. Shaida Omar at the Teddy Bear Clinic. Okay, so we want to look at the way forward and also understand what our position is as parents, because yes, it starts at home. We are the strength, we are the chain, the weakest link, the strongest pillar. How do we as parents initiate and continuously understand that our children are exposed to a vast world out there? We cannot cocoon them. The minute they step out and go to a play school, a play date, or to school, they are influenced by others' behavior and exposed to other people's characters. So offset, I know Dr. Shaida displayed a beautiful sort of, understanding of what is wrong, my space and all of that. But how is it that parents sometimes do unfortunately say the wrong things, and it doesn't help the situation?
So what we get stuck in the cycle of, we start parenting the way we were parented. And I think for every parent, first they need to recognize that. First they need to recognize what kind of parent they are, And what we need to accept is that the generation is different. We cannot parent this generation necessarily the way we were parented. And what happens is that we assume, okay, hidings, tell you what to do, very didactically, we autocratic. It doesn't work with this generation because our levels of anxiety and depression are increasing rapidly, which means the autonomy, the choices, instead of punishment, there should be natural consequences. And that's why choice comes in terms of creating a responsible adult means they need to choose what they're going to do and understand there's a consequence to those choices.
But what does all of that mean to the layman? How do they give that? Because this could be all, foreign to them, very novel, not understanding giving your child a choice.
It's totally different because we were never given that choice.
Yes.
So, and that's what parents say to us is we've never been given the choice and we've been fine. Yeah. But actually, if you look at the subtleties, there's actually things that are wrong with not, because children and adolescents then go into a power struggle if they're not given those choices. So it's not about also didactically or saying to your child, this is what you're going to do. It's about either you're going to eat in 5 minutes or you're going to eat in 10. You can choose. It's not about saying you're going to eat now, because the less choice they have, the more the power struggle is going to be there. Parents also get stuck in the cycle of when the child comes and says, Mom, this child was mean to me, we go, don't worry about it, just ignore them, walk away. That means you're nullifying the child's
feelings,
experience.
Dr.
I
Ahmad?
think Jasmine has touched on something very important, because sometimes parents will say that child will stop, or sometimes parents will say, well, go back and take action.
Yes.
You know,
what are you going to do about it? Yeah.
Don't allow him or her to do that to you. So normalizing that kind of problem solving or conflict resolution, where children start internalizing that. But I think when you said about what must parents do, I think firstly, parents need to role model. And what Jasmine spoke about is they need to look at how they were treated as children, how they were raised, how they were socialized, the parenting styles that they were exposed to. So there needs to be an awareness and analyzing their own values and attitudes. Where do they actually come from? Their thought processes, their beliefs, their values. And again, I think punitive forms of engagement with children was the norm in the past. We know now with corporal punishment banned within the school structure and even at home, it's not acceptable. But it's harder, you know, we think it's easier to resort to physical punishment or using a stick or a ruler, whatever. It's actually harder for a parent to sit down and actually say, I can see something is wrong. I'm not sure what's going on. Can we talk about it? It seems like you're so frazzled today, or you seem to have had a hard day. You know, the child will come and throw the bag down, or, mommy, or something like that, to say.
And then you get upset as well.
So I think what Jasmine is saying, that more energy, more investment in dialoguing with your child, the ability to listen, to, you know, the deep active listening. What is it that my child is actually saying to me when my child throws the bag down? It's that unsaid, the message that hasn't been actually verbalized. And that's what I think is critical. Parents need to start talking to children, talking about daily things, sharing maybe their day and waiting in exchange to ask, so what happened with you today? You know?
I was just going to say, you know, we focus a lot on the child that's being bullied. Once again, it's about parents. If they identify that the child is the bully, it's also about not to go into a punitive style with them. It's about understanding what they're thinking and how they understand why they're doing what they're doing. Otherwise, if you become punitive, whether it's physical, whether it's emotional, that child then learns that that bully was actually okay, you know, because we can't expect the child to do something different if we're doing to them what we don't want them to do to anyone else. So it's about showing the child that violence, aggression is not something to resort to. Making someone feel bad about themselves is not something, because that's what parents do. You're so naughty, how could you do this, you know, and we start insulting. And that insult, in a way, is actually bullying the child themselves.
So how can we go back? We know we're doing it. We're realizing this is the better way of doing it. Help us as parents take a better step forward. So recognizing what you're doing, because you did it.
Have to stop.
Sometimes you just do it without thinking it.
And parents have to stop, take a step back. And then, in fact, that moment of, I'm going to respond to this later, that's what you should actually do. Okay. Don't respond when you're upset.
Sort of that angry moment thing.
Yes, absolutely. That's the golden thumb, the rule, you know, the rule of thumb. The moment you feel the emotions are running high, actually stop and say, I need to stop here and walk out. Walk away from the situation. And when you're more calm and contained, there'll definitely be a different response, a more positive response.
Because parents are saying they're feeling overwhelmed by these children.
And remember also, mums will shout at the child, and then they're like, wait till dad comes home, and then they complain to dad. So the child doesn't just get one consequence. They're getting shouted by mom, and then they're getting shouted or possibly hit by dad later on. So they're getting a double consequence. What parents should do is actually, mom and dad, we're going to discuss it together, and we're going to come to you later and have a conversation about this. You know, and once again, it's not to didactically tell the child what to do, when to do it, and how to do it. It's actually ask them. Ask them the questions so that they come up with the answers, because when they're talking about it in terms of what was good, what was bad, they're processing that information. So what you're doing is you're helping your child to think about the situation.
Very true.
You're not telling the
teaching a
child
behavior,
you're
teaching a
not
good
telling them.
behavior.
Because remember, with children or adolescents, the moment you tell them something, they're like, it's out of their ears in 2 seconds.
But even when you're setting up rules and limits, you're going to ask them, okay, so if this happens again, what do you think we should do? So giving back that power and control to the child, and that child is coming up with a consequence, not you.
Very true.
So there's a sense of ownership in this process. But something I think we as parents often fail to do is validation of our children. We're quick to jump and respond to negative behaviors, but we fail to respond to any positive demonstrations or efforts made by children. And I think that's the cue.
Recognizing our kids in our lives and
for the
making them
little
part of it.
things. We mustn't look for the big leaps and jumps. It's for the little things. Because
Absolutely.
that in itself will create those big leaps.
We have to wrap up. I want to look at sort of helping those sitting with depression, the message that we need to give to our teenagers via the parent or yourself to help us, members of the community. What are the sort of symptoms? What do we watch out for? And where can they go for help?
So look for changes in the mood, in sleep, in appetite, in social functioning, in terms of your energy as well. So those are the main symptoms of depression. Any talk of self-harm or not wanting to be alive, that also should be a trigger. Parents and child, and I think children and adolescents need to understand they can ask for help as well, be it whether they start off by telling a teacher, be it whether they go to the school counselor, or even if they access service at the nearest clinic or the nearest hospital. Parents can do absolutely the same thing. You know, they can ask for help from a psychologist, a psychiatrist, even if you go to your GP first and get the GP to refer you. And remember, finances shouldn't stop the intervention. State services offer those services at a very low cost, and people can access that. You have SADAC, who's a free organization that you can phone for help. There's Childline as well. So it's to look at all of that and ask for help.
Yeah. So Dr. Omar, your advice on a safe website, safe literature, where can people go to educate themselves as well?
Well, I think the important thing that Jasmine has spoken to, that SADC offers a wide range of literature online that people can access. And there's a toll-free number, 0800 567 567, and Childline 0800 55555, which is a 24-hour toll-free number, and it's at no cost. So I think the important thing is that by reaching out doesn't show a sign of weakness. It's actually an act of strength and courage. So we need to act before it becomes too late.
Let's talk about teenage suicide and bullying and keep that conversation going and ask ourselves, are we maybe bullying our children? Thank you so much to Jasmine Kuvaji, head of the psychology units at Tabata, and Dr. Shahid Omar from the Teddy Bear Clinic. We hope to see you ladies again. All the best and thank you so much for your time. Assalamu alaikum and good evening. So there you had it. This conversation doesn't end here. Talk about it. Talk to your children in the mosques, in your churches, in your community, somebody that you're sitting next to in a taxi. Let's understand what it's all actually really about. Next week, watch out for World Kidney Day. Wassalamu alaikum and goodbye for now.